we have spending that is literally out of control. The only time I've ever heard a Democrat, most of the time they're honest, they don't care about the debt, but the only time I've ever heard them say anything about the debt is, well, you know, it happens because you cut taxes. Well, you know, it's verifiably false. You can go back to the Reagan tax cuts when the rates went from 70 to 50 and then from 50 to 28. You know what happened? The government got more revenue. Because when you tax people less, when you let them keep more of their own money, guess what? Their incentives to produce go up, and the economy grows by leaps and bounds. So when Reagan cut taxes dramatically, the economy responded and grew tremendously. When we cut taxes in 2017, same thing. Revenue didn't go down, revenue went up. So how did the deficit get worse? Why did the deficit get worse? Was it because we cut taxes in 2017? No, it was because we piled on the money. We just are spending money like there's no tomorrow. So before we get to the extraordinary times we live in now, where everything's about COVID and we're just going to spend money like there is no tomorrow, before we got to that, we were borrowing $1 trillion a year. So the main segments of government, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, other welfare, and military. That probably comprises 3/4 or more of government. If you look at that on an annual basis, before you get to the extraordinary binge of the last 2 years, we were already $1 trillion short every year, $1 trillion short. So last year we added a couple trillion more, and our deficit for the year, for 1 year, was $3 trillion. We've never, ever borrowed that much. There are going to be ramifications. You're already seeing some of the ramifications. You're seeing the prices in the grocery store go up. You're seeing the prices in the pump go up. You're seeing sometimes wages go up, but you're also seeing prices rising faster than wages, which often happens in an inflationary cycle. Some people have trouble comprehending how these numbers, what's a billion, what's a trillion. Reagan had an analogy he did, and he said that if you want to know how big a billion is, take $1,000 bills and put them in your hand. When you have them about 4 inches high, you've got $1 million. But if you want to know how much or how tall a stack of $1,000 would be if you had $1 trillion, it'd be 60 miles high, over 60 miles high. That's what kind of money we're talking about. That was to get to $1 trillion. So we have $1 trillion institutional debt that's added every year. But now we're talking about a time where they're talking about adding in one bill $3.5 trillion. The bill that they have before us has $1 billion in spending for every page. Every page of the bill has an extra $1 billion in spending. It's extraordinary. We've never ever seen anything like this. What happens when a country destroys its currency? We have examples in history. In Germany in 1923, the money was starting to lose its value in about September, and a loaf of bread might have cost 100 marks, where before it cost 1 mark. 2 weeks later, it was 1,000 marks, but then 2 weeks later, it was 10,000 marks, and then it was 1 million, and then it was several million. This happened in a 2-month period of time. People say, oh, when it comes, when the currency unravels, it'll be gradual. In Germany, it happened in a 2-month period. In Venezuela, the currency is completely worthless, same as Germany. It's almost better to burn your currency for fuel or warmth than it is to spend it. This is what happens when you have runaway spending and out-of-control deficits. Venezuela is one of the richest countries in South America. They have more oil underground than Saudi Arabia. But frankly, socialism doesn't work. Socialism is this borrow and spend. It is this alarming tendency to want to offer everybody everything and say it's going to be free. Many of these things backfire. For the last year, we've been saying, well, oh gosh, we feel sorry for workers, so we're going to pay them while they're unemployed. But guess what? If you pay them more than the market wage, more of them will choose unemployment, and more of them will choose unemployment, and more of them will stay unemployed for a longer period of time. We found this out in the 2008 recession. During the 2008 recession, we extended unemployment. It's normally 26 weeks. It's paid for by a tax, and it largely works within the confines of a state-run program. We extended it to 99 weeks, almost 2 years. But you know what the studies found? And this is part of the syndrome we have around here. It's sort of the big heart, small brain syndrome. I think many of these people want to help people. They just don't understand, but what they're doing is actually hurting the same people they're trying to help. So if you extend unemployment to 99 weeks, And then all of a sudden, the guy at 99 weeks or a woman says, I need to get a job. And they go to the employer and they say, I've been out of work for 99 weeks. I've been on unemployment. And the other person applying for the job says, well, I've been out of work 10 weeks and I'm looking for a job. Who do you think the employer hires? Every time. It's a person out of work 10 weeks. The person out of 99 weeks, they're like, might be something wrong here. We might have gotten to the point where we've lost work ethic. So what have you done to that person that you tried to help? You've actually kept them out of the workplace so long that they become unemployable. After they become unemployable, what do they become? The permanently unemployable, the non-working part. You wonder who this is? 62% of the country is in the working force, 38% is not. These are people permanently out of the workforce. These aren't people who can't work. These are just people, for one reason or another, are no longer in the workforce. Now, some of them can be people who can't work, and we have sympathy for that. But many of them are people who just stayed out of work too long or took the wrong incentives or became addicted to drugs or alcohol because they weren't working. So there are things we can do in our country, but if we're not careful, it's going to slip away from us. I don't want our country to be Venezuela. I don't want our country to destroy its currency. But what we're offering is a more difficult sell, because the other side is going to give you free college and free daycare and free cars and free cell phones. What we are offering is opportunity. What we're offering is the freedom to try to strive. We're offering equality before the law, not equality of outcome after you've done your work, after you've tried to participate. Equality before the law. And one of the interesting things that I think isn't often grasped by people is that if you want equal outcomes, if you want everybody to be the same and you want to equalize everybody, you actually have to treat them unequally. And in our country, it took a while, but we've gotten to the point where people truly believe in the concept of equality before the law. But if you also want to believe in equal outcomes at the end, realize you can't believe in both. They're mutually exclusive. You cannot believe in equality before the law if you want equal outcomes. If you want this so-called equity at the end, you want everybody to be equal at the end, you've got to treat them unequally. Because some people are either born with more talent, born with more money, born with more sense, luckier, work harder. There's a lot of reasons. If you put 100 people in a room and you give them all $5, within an hour, somebody's gotten more. Somebody had some cigarettes, somebody really wanted to smoke, and they've got another $1. The money spreads around the room. They've done these experiments. Money doesn't stay in one place. But it's by and large in a free society based on work. But once the government becomes in charge of things, it becomes less of a meritocracy and becomes more of a society based on who you know. So there are rich people. Don't get me wrong. And when you look at socialism, there are rich people. Maduro, Chavez, Castro, incredibly rich people. They own their own islands, they have billions of dollars. Their relatives are all rich. So instead of a society mostly based on merit, we talk about the greatness of America. One of the most important things about capitalism and freedom and what happened in America is for the first time, it wasn't based on who you were. It wasn't based on royal lineage. For the most part, Europe was, long-time landowners and royalty. And a very small percentage of the public did very well. In fact, before 1820, before the Industrial Revolution, virtually everybody in the world, 98% of the world lived in extreme poverty, a bare subsistence level, barely enough to eat. There was no obesity because there was barely enough food. You just scraped by. That was 98% of the world. Fast forward to today, after we've adopted what Adam Smith talked about as far as trade, division of labor, and capitalism, you know what we have now? When you look at poverty, less than $2 a day in the world, it's less than 10% of the world. You won't find this on television. There's not going to be any good news on television or in the newspaper. The poorest people in our country actually are equivalent to the middle class in most countries. We are a huge success, but we're a country misguided and led astray by media that aren't honest. So for example, if you watched CNN, you would think that nobody's getting vaccinated and it's a complete disaster and whoa, we're stuck in this rut because no one's vaccinated. It's completely untrue. Over 90% of people over 65 who are the most vulnerable are vaccinated. Now, sure, there are a lot of younger people who aren't vaccinated. There's some older people, but 90% is a pretty good success. Over age 50, it's like 75, 80% of people. People are informed. They know this is a disease that can affect any age, but affects primarily the older ages. For example, the one truth you won't be told is an 85-year-old has a 10,000 times greater chance of dying than the 10-year-old. Now, you think we should treat them the same? If you were their doctor, do you think a 10-year-old should get the same health care and the same prescriptions for what they need to do as an 85-year-old? Makes no sense at all. I see 10-year-olds and I see 5-year-olds out on the mall. My wife and I are walking down to the Lincoln Memorial the other day, and I see 5-year-olds in groups led by teachers wearing masks outside. There is no science to that. We got Dr. Fauci spreading mistruths across the country, saying we've got to forcibly vaccinate the kids. There's no science behind any of that. In fact, England is rejecting what we're doing. In England, because of the age skew, because of what they're seeing, that the people most at risk are of an older age, they're actually saying, instead of forcibly vaccinating children, why don't we try to make the vaccine doses available for the elderly? Why don't we target our care to those who are at highest risk? We have a problem in our country. We have people who have so politicized science that there are people struggling and dying every day because they've never heard about monoclonal antibodies. We have people dying every day because the government, at the behest of Dr. Fauci and a few other people, have said you can't get monoclonal antibodies if you're in the hospital. I talk to people every day who really have not yet heard of monoclonal antibodies, who get COVID again after being fully vaccinated or sometimes not being vaccinated and are not getting the treatment. Because Dr. Fauci says if you're in the hospital, you don't get it. And so we have medicine that is coming from on high, from a central authority like the Politburo, and doctors are afraid to prescribe. This has never happened in our country before. Doctors were able to make their own decisions based on their own experience, based on studies, based on real-life examples, but using their own discretion. Now doctors are afraid to prescribe monoclonal antibodies, and many of them are disallowed from prescribing it in the inpatient. Realize the ridiculous nature of that. You're in the emergency room, you're sick and you're coughing, you might be dying from COVID. You get to the emergency room, you don't know what to say, you can barely talk. Your spouse has to be able to tell the doctor, please stop in the emergency room. Give them the monoclonal antibodies before they're admitted, because once they're admitted, we won't treat them. It's the same way with symptoms. You have to have symptoms within the first 10 days. If you don't have symptoms, if you're on day 11, you won't get monoclonal antibodies. It's completely arbitrary, it's capricious, and it has to do with government-mandated guidelines. Let's take some of the other truths or mistruths that are out there. I've said over and over again cloth masks don't work, because they don't. Peer-reviewed studies have shown time and time again cloth masks don't work. But when Dr. Fauci tells you all masks work, when he comes in all draped with 3 masks on himself, with little insignias, clever insignias of different sports teams, he's actually spreading a mistruth that causes lives to be lost. Why? Let's say you have a 75-year-old woman and she gets COVID and her husband's taking care of her. Do you think the advice to go into the room to feed her, bathe her, help her get in and out of her clothes while she's sick, wearing a cloth mask is a good idea or a bad idea? It's malpractice. And yet, for some reason, the left-wing media has lauded this man as the second coming, and what he's telling you is absolutely verifiably dangerous to your health. The only mask that really works of any real value is the N95 mask. The surgical masks have some value, but not very much. Most of the air is going around the mask. They just aren't of value, but you have to submit. The man's telling you to do it. You got to do what you got to do. But the thing is when you tell people something's safe, they tend to react to that and have behavior, and in their behavior, they're in favor of something that may well actually be risky behavior for them. The vaccinations, because we ignore natural immunity, we directed the vaccine to the wrong people and still are. So for example, because of Dr. Fauci's lead, India is accepting his lead as well. In India, there's not enough vaccine. They have 1 billion people. They can't vaccinate enough people fast enough. So if you have 1 billion people and you have 200 million doses of vaccine, who do you think you should give it to? Should you give it to the 10-year-old the same as the 85-year-old? No, that's ridiculous. But what about 2 65-year-olds, and one of them's had COVID and one of them hasn't? The studies are plentiful. The studies are throughout that say that if you've already had it, you have natural immunity to COVID, as good or better than the vaccine. Do you think it makes good public health policy to say that everybody that's 65 should get it, instead of saying, have you had it? Why don't we check you for antibodies if you think you've had it? maybe you should wait until we've vaccinated every 65-year-old that doesn't have immunity. These are the real things. These are real discussions. But if you have these, unless it's on the Senate floor, actually that's not even true. You can say this on the Senate floor and YouTube will take it down. I've had it happen. I've given speeches on the floor that YouTube takes down. So this is a world in which people need to realize and get back to the ideas of classical liberalism were that we debated things. Classical liberalism was about skepticism. It was about you having your opinion and me having my opinion. But the difference between the elitist or the collectivist point of view and the individual rights point of view is, I believe you have every right to your opinion. But if you're a collectivist and you believe that from the very top down, all medical decisions come from Dr. Fauci, and if he doesn't want you to fly, you don't get to fly, see, it's different from individual liberty, because I think if you have a differing opinion, you're welcome to your opinion. And if an airline has a policy I don't like, maybe I'd choose not to fly. But the idea that we're going to restrict everyone's behavior based on what they decide to do, what's next? People eat too many cheeseburgers, we're not going to give them a heart stent because we think they haven't behaved and they haven't listened to the doctors on what they should be eating. There is no end to this. But in the end, if we're not careful, we are going to spend this country into oblivion. COVID's a big cost of the extra spending we have now. But I can tell you, there are ramifications. They're coming quick. They're coming in the form of higher prices. But there is no reason in the world for us to default. We have plenty of money. We should simply pay for the interest based on what comes in every month. And with that, I'd like to reserve my time and turn it over.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Sure.
Senator Paul, when you and I were both elected to the Senate back in 2010, I remember the national debt was an issue then. It was becoming large enough that people were concerned about it. And as it mounted, sometimes we had conversations about how long it might continue, how long it might continue to spiral upward. You surprised to see that here we are 11 years later, 11 years after you and I arrived here, and where it's gone since then?
I guess surprise is not the word I would choose. I would say disappointed. You know, the Tea Party movement, we had 100,000 people on the mall out there. People were concerned about the debt. They were concerned about constitutional government. I remember you and I meeting for the first time and talking about how we needed to reverse some of these terrible precedents that had allowed government to grow large, and that the courts need to reform government as well as government be reformed from its elected officials. But yeah, we had a great debate that summer. In the summer of 2011, we said we wouldn't raise the debt ceiling without reform.